Mike, this is an opinion question on the basis of your analysis of the religious climate. The questioner asks, if an extraterrestrial reality is proven to be true, will Christians be able to accept this reality, possibly learn from extraterrestrials, accept their help if they offer it, or would Christians reject the extraterrestrial reality as being from the devil?
I think if they buy the tape of my session, that'll help. I must be getting tired. I think that, I don't want to minimize the magnitude of something like that, but I tend to think that initially there would be I think a fairly extremely adverse reaction. But I do think a significant portion of the church would have the stability to look to theologians for answers. I would hope that there would be coherent answers. If there aren't coherent answers, then the damage would be greater. But I think we've had other really significant paradigm shifts. Just take Darwinism, for example. I mean, when Darwinism came along and people understood what Darwin was saying, some Christians just freaked out and totally rejected it. Other ones yawned, through the whole thing. So I think you'd have a variety of reactions. Obviously, the church is still here. It's not here because everybody rejected it. It's not here because everybody embraced it. But it was seen as something that, if it's part of the general revelation, that's a theological term. Christian theology teaches that all truth is God's truth. General revelation refers to that which is in the created order, that which is part of creation. And if these beings are indeed part of the created order, then general revelation says that God must be responsible for this as well, and we need to adjust our paradigm. And I think a lot of people would do that, but I think it would be a bumpy road early on.
So you're sort of a moderate optimist on how the Christian population would respond.
I'm a cautious optimist.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike.
That reminds me, I
Yes,
just
Dave.
wanted to see if I could get you to talk about the angel scroll, or if that's verboten still, or because it kind of fits into that idea.
You know what?
Start at the beginning. Angel scroll.
Okay, I'm sitting here thinking, do I really need to not say anything about this or say anything about this? In my novel, The Facade, there's a scene in which a couple of the characters are talking about the implications of extraterrestrial life, and of course in the book they're confronted, with evidence that they are deducing or debating about whether it's genuine or not as far as extraterrestrials. And they get into a discussion about, okay, how does this relate to eschatology? How does this relate to the end of the world? Because there's this linkage that we've hinted at tonight, and this is just one wing, one possibility of how Scripture might relate to the UFO question. That's this Genesis 6 Sons of God incident. And Jesus makes the statement that when the Son of Man returns, referring to himself, that it would be as it was in the days of Noah, when there was marrying and giving in marriage. And if you go back to Genesis 6, the only ones that are said to be marrying and giving in marriage are the sons of God. And so the characters are getting into this discussion, and the one says, boy, you think that's bad. I've seen a scroll called the Angel Scroll that says in it that at the time of the end, Jerusalem will be surrounded by thousands of sun discs. Now, the Angel Scroll may or may not be real. A few years ago, I was at a conference, biblical studies conference, and to make a long story short, I knew a guy who lived in Jerusalem that I saw at the conference. Hadn't seen him for a number of years, and I had just read in a magazine from Jerusalem about this thing called the Angel Scroll. It was supposed to be another Dead Sea Scroll found in a different region of Qumran. And so I asked the guy, I said, hey, have you heard about this Angel Scroll? What's the scuttlebutt on that? And he said, well, I know the guy who's editing it. I said, you got to be kidding. And he said, no, and he's going to be here in about 15 minutes. You want to meet him? And I said, well, yeah, sure. So I met this guy. His name is Steve Fond. His wife was the secretary of the director of the Dead Sea Scrolls Project, who has since retired. And Steve is still over there. And I said, what's this about the angel scroll? And he said, well, I just got this thing from a couple, I guess, like antiquities dealers or something. And he said, but I've not seen the real thing. All I have is a hand-drawn transcription of about 3/4 of it. And he looked at me, he said, well, I really want to go hear so-and-so in a session. You come on with me and we can talk. So we sit down. I don't know this guy. It's the first time I've ever met this guy. We sit down at the session. He pops open his briefcase, and there amidst the Snickers wrappers and all this other stuff, he says, hey, you want to see the angel scroll? And I'm like, who's speaking? So there I am. It's all in Hebrew, and he has a rough translation and some things marked. So I'm flipping through the angel scroll while this guy's talking. And there was a phrase in it that said, again, at the time of the end, it's a very apocalyptic scroll, that Jerusalem will be surrounded, and it's the only line I remember in the whole thing, by Alpei Shemeshot Sevavot, which means thousands of round things that are like the sun. Okay, thousands of sun disks. Now, that was in 1999. So in the intervening time, there were other things in the angel scroll that I was intrigued by that related to my dissertation, or would have. And so I asked Steve, I said, what are you going to do with this thing? And he said, he goes, I'm going to edit it, I'm going to treat it like any other scroll, and I'm not going to publish it. And I said, why? He goes, I will not publish anything unless I see the original, because all I have is a hand-drawn transcription. It could be an utter fake. And that was in 1999. I've talked to Steve 2 or 3 times, and the people who supposedly own the angel scroll have never produced the actual scroll. And so Steve has just concluded that basically he'd been had, and he's just not, he can't do anything more with it. He will not publish the material unless he knows it's genuine, because you have to subject it to carbon-14, you have to subject it to paleographical analysis, which correlates carbon-14, plus or minus 50 years or so within the discipline of manuscript study. And he said, until I see the actual scroll, it's a dead duck. And so that's pretty much where it's at.
Thank you so much, Mike.
The next question is addressed to Richard regarding a slide that you showed us of fractal analysis done by Dr. Carlotto, I believe. Mm-hmm. The question is...
In 92.
Yes. Wouldn't drumlins, eskers, and erratics, earthly geologic anomalous features, result in bright areas from fractal analysis, even though they have a natural cause?
The theory of the fractal analysis is very interesting. It's come to light and matured basically because of the warlike nature of the folks here on planet Earth. In particular, during the first Gulf War, it was used with great success to find the tanks of Hussein in the deserts of southern Iraq, even though they'd been buried up to their turrets and lay in wait for Schwarzkopf and the American forces. And it was based on satellite imagery subjected to this automated computer process, look ma, no hands, no subjective judgments involved. In other words, the fact that it looks to human eyes like a face is irrelevant to the algorithm. What the algorithm is looking for is what's called self-similarity. And what we know is that natural forces, erosion, even biology, produce self-similar, fractal, repeating patterns. Like the edges of leaves will have serrations, where the serrations go down in scale, or coastlines that have repeating tributary patterns as you reduce the scale. Well, the landscapes under erosive geology are self-similar. But when you photograph an object of an artificial nature, let's say this book, if you can get a picture with high enough resolution to see the book, sitting on one of those mesas, it has very different self-similarity to its surrounding pixels, surrounding neighborhood. So what the computer is picking out is the difference in the pattern produced by the regular geometry of the book and the texture of the book compared to the texture and geometry of the surrounding natural terrain. So it's quite reliable. It was used in a practical context during the war. It's something that the DoD, is using Rumsfeld and company are using it even now, looking for caches of weapons of mass destruction and all that. So what Mark and Stein did is to transfer this cutting-edge technology to the Martian scenario, and it turned out that the face, totally separate from what it looks like, is the most non-fractal, the most non-self-similar object on that landscape for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of square miles. That is what science is. It's totally independent confirmation that something about this is really, really cool, and it would behoove us to take a closer look.
Beautiful way to describe science. Thank you, Richard. The next question is addressed to Drs. Nelson and Ross. Does your theology prevent the possibility of extraterrestrial life?
No.
Yeah, I've already addressed that in the negative as well. I mean, the fact that we have an article posted on our website which indicates that there's a range of possibilities.
Yes. And so even though the probability is very, very small, you do have the openness to that within the framework of your theological belief. So that's not excluding.
Open in the context of the creator creating this species somewhere else. We would not be open to a naturalistic interpretation.
Thank you for that clarification. Another question for Dr. Ross that fascinates me. What if a civilization very early on had the technology to leave their planet and essentially have an ecosystem, a planet within some sort of traveling mechanism, that they could travel long distances and endure their entire civilization within that traveling system? And could that then visit our galaxy as well as others?
Yeah, I actually addressed that in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, that what you're talking about is building an artificial planet that could sustain an ecology long enough to make the 25,000-year one-way journey. In terms of what you have to build into this artificial planet, economically, I'd like to suggest that it'd probably be less expenditure of energy and resources to actually move the planet that you're on, rather than try to build an artificial planet and go there. And it'd be safer. You would lose less lives if you were to do that.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yes, Richard.
You watch Star Trek at all? Particularly the first season, the old shows?
Well, it's hard for me to watch Star Trek because usually about 2 minutes into the episode, they're violating half dozen laws of physics. But occasionally I force myself to watch it because...
Do you remember an episode where McCoy got sick? I think it was third season of last year.
No, I don't remember that one.
Where the title is what's important. It was about a hollowed-out asteroid and a civilization traveling between stars. The slow boat idea. That you take thousands of years to go because you're not getting up near the speed of light and you don't have the radiation. It's all done in three-dimensional space. It's basically a long, long, long time by a culture which has had great success in biology and sociodynamics and closed system ecologies and all that. But the title was what got me, because it's just so poetic. The title was, "For the world is hollow, and I have touched the sky." It was a story of one person's discovery that they were on the inside of a hollow world.
Well, you could actually build such a hollow world. In fact, serious plans to design an artificial planet would have people living on the inside shell of some kind of cylinder where you would rotate it to simulate gravity.
Gerard O'Neill at Princeton on that concept.
Right. And the bigger you make it, the longer you're going to be able to have the people inside survive. You want to make it as big as possible. And you're also correct that you want to move this artificial planet as slow as you can conceive of. But given that there's a finite time on the longevity for a technological species...
Where does that come from? Where does that number come from?
I listed 11 things that could restrict the longevity of a civilization. Probably the two that are the most confining is something we've observed just in the 20th century, that the more affluent you become, the fewer children you choose to have, just based on pure economics. If you're agrarian and the poor, the more children you have...
Genetic reproductive methods. You have total control of the population.
Well, that's something you would have to envision, but people aren't going to do it willingly if they have a lot of money. And then the other thing, which is probably more significant, is that the greater the technology, the longer a couple puts off having children, just because it takes a while to get the experience and the education you need to sustain a family.
What about breakthroughs in lifespan?
Well, I mean, I've argued that you could conceive of lifespans as long as, say, 1,000 years. Getting beyond 1,000 years is difficult because I can't conceive of any radiation environment that the universe would permit that would allow a longer lifespan than 1,000 years. I mean, radiation operates to degrade our protein.
Yeah, but wait. Isn't biology anti-entropic? Isn't it self-repairing? If we learn
to a
enough
limited
genetic
extent.
engineering, well, to our current knowledge, to a limited extent, but we don't know everything.
And so, Richard, if we could let Dr. Ross go on, there's 11 assumptions you were saying there that create that number that Richard was questioning you about.
Well, the list I gave you this morning or this afternoon, I started off with those characteristics that are from the hard sciences, but typically don't put that strong of a limit. You know, just the fact that you have the star getting brighter, and there's a limit to how long you can compensate for that.
Do you remember NASA's plan last year to move Earth?
Well,
Remember that one?
okay, if you move Earth any closer,
No, farther away, to match the luminosity brightness of the sun.
yeah,
You could prolong it billions of years at that rate if you could move the Earth. And they had a way with current technology. It's amazing. Current technology, NASA's envisioned a way to move the whole planet. Art Bell was furious because he figured they'd louse it up.
there are problems with trying to move the Earth out of its current position. As I tried to mention in my brief time, is that you have the Earth-Moon system designed in such a way that it breaks up the destructive resonances that operate in our solar system.
Well, this would move both because of the Barry Center. In other words, the moon comes along.
Yeah,
for
but
the
you know, you
ride.
got to move Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune as well.
Why?
Because those are the four bodies that are setting up the destructive resonances in the inner solar system. And the Earth, the moon orbiting about the Earth, works in a way to actually protect the entire inner solar system from these resonances. However, if you start to move the Earth-Moon system out of its current orbit, you now throw that out of sync. And so now you run the risk of these resonances becoming more destructive. For example,
Yeah, but if you have a technology that can compensate for the dissonance, who cares?
yeah, but you need a gravity field to do that.
And that's not what they proposed.
No, it's not what they're,
my
what they're
sense is-
ignoring. They're ignoring the effects that the gas giant planets have on the supportability of life on planet Earth. If you bring the Earth any closer to those gas giants, you're asking for trouble.
It leads us to a question that came up a couple times for Richard Hoagland and David Flynn in terms of your understanding of the composition of the quote-unquote pristine solar system, the original solar system, and what happened to it to get us to our current circumstances.
Why don't you go first?
Well, I don't know how much sense
Unless
it
you
would
want
make.
me to go second.
No.
It's getting late.
In the beginning, you know, God makes the heavens and the earth, and then there's this gap. There's the gap theory. The idea that there was incredible amount of time, we don't know. We can speculate. Of course, the Hebrew sages say that they've actually calculated how long that time was just by the text itself, and it's pretty convoluted exactly how that's done. But in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, you're going to have this time where apparently something happened. And is it possible to have the second law of thermodynamics not exist? I mean, within the physical laws that we have right now, is that something that could have been inserted into the picture where before it didn't? It wasn't inserted. I don't know if that's a possibility, but it
Yeah,
sounds
it's not a possibility because stars depend very critically on the operation of the four fundamental forces and the second law of thermodynamics. Disturb them even by 1 part in 10,000 trillion, and stars will either instantly explode or they'll never form.
I don't believe it.
It's true. I mean, it's been in the literature
No,
since
I'm sorry, I don't believe
1961.
You know, you seem to know these things to 0.000001, and we
No,
don't.
look, it's this easy, Richard. You take a solar model, and any star is a balance between gravitational forces working to crush it
Right.
and the radiation forces working to expand
Right.
it. Okay, if you work through the differential equations that show you the equilibrium of a star, you
Yeah,
will
the
discover.
equation of state for the star.
Yeah, I mean, it's just 4 equations you got to work through.
Okay.
They were published by Schwarzschild back in the 50s. And what you discover is if you change the ratio of the force of gravity to the force of electromagnetism by 1 part in 10 to the 40th, stars are no longer stable. It's that
Yeah,
sensitive.
but stars aren't stable now.
Well,
Look at all these variables.
what I mean
Look
by
at
stable-
Cepheids, Look at,
Now, what I mean by
Mira
stable
variables.
are stars capable of burning for billions of years. If you change that ratio by 1
But who
part in
says
10
they
to
have
the
to burn
40th,
for billions of years?
well, how about just days? Okay, that's how sensitive this is. You change it by the tiniest amount, and the stars won't even be stable for short times, let alone long
What you're
times.
saying is that you'll get a positive feedback loop so that an instability will lead to either collapse or explosion.
Correct.
Okay. And I don't believe it's that sensitive.
And so, Richard, let me
work
go the
out the
direction I
equations.
think you're going with this question for Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross, have you considered how the differential rotation of the star participates in creating a stable system?
Okay, what are you exactly getting at in terms of, I mean, yeah, you're right. Stars do have differential rotation as you go from the surface down into the interior.
I'm going to let Richard explain the importance of that in the hyperdimensional physics model.
Funny you should ask, okay? God, you'd almost think we planned this. Let me show you and Hugh something that is, again, really, really cool, all right? During the Voyager program, all right, which was the unmanned space mission which went to Jupiter and then Saturn, the Voyager spacecraft actually went by Saturn and they were able to photograph and rectify oblique images that showed the north polar regions. Where is your laser pointer? Oh my
Are we
God.
talking the sun or Saturn?
No, we're talking Saturn, all right? This is
Saturn.
Saturn.
So we're talking differential rotation in Saturn?
Hang on, that's not what I'm worried about. What they found was when they photographed this region up here obliquely and then rectified, this was, I forget the guy's name at the University of Arizona, they found that they had this extraordinary hexagonal pattern of clouds that rotated at a different rate than the rotation of the clouds all around it and maintained its geometry for months as the spacecraft approached and then went away. It was a coherent geometric structure in the cloud decks at the North Polar region of 76 degrees north latitude. And when you compare it to the hyperdimensional tetrahedral model, you get the same hexagonal pattern. The force structure that we've been proposing inside planets, planetary dynamics based on this math, produces this kind of signature. So then, a couple, 3 years ago, NASA did helioseismology of the sun. And lo and behold, the same kind of pattern shows up at the north polar region of the sun at about the same latitude with differential rotation. The helioseismology guys can get the curves going down several thousand miles. And finally, they did the same kind of rectification from Cassini of Jupiter during the flyby last year, and you get the same kind of hyperdimensional, tetrahedral, hexagonal pattern on Jupiter, which is remarkable empirical evidence that the fluid flow in these bodies, massive spinning systems, is somehow being constrained by the math that Maxwell himself was interested in over 100 years ago. My point being that stars are more interesting than the standard model, and until we get the complete picture, we can't say much about stability because we don't know enough to say things about stability yet. This is proof, because they haven't a clue what's going on here. The mainstream guys, JPL guys, they haven't a clue. Ingersoll throws up his hands. He's the big guy at Caltech that's planetary dynamics at JPL.
Yeah, I know who he is.
Yeah, well, they may not.
Yeah.
So the point is, our ignorance wondrously outweighs our certitude. And that's what science to me is all about. Finding out things you didn't know by asking real questions.
I'd like to interject at this point that on Richard's website, the hyperdimensional model is presented with a number of predictions that if the hyperdimensional model is correct, then these observations will occur through science over coming years, and this would be related, I believe.
Yeah, well, one of the key predictions is right here. Jupiter radiates about 3 times more energy than it gets from the sun, from any known source. Saturn is around
3 degrees warmer than what you would predict.
No. 3 times.
I don't know where you're getting that figure
No.
from.
I will send you the papers. This was found by, who's the big infrared guy at the University of Arizona back in the 60s? They started doing ground-based studies. He then took his instrument to a Learjet above the atmosphere. The Voyager mission got a baseline. Cassini has now given us data. It turns out that these giant planets, I mean, here's the actual curve. Jupiter is emitting roughly 3 times more than it derives from solar input at its distance from the sun. What we did was to take this model, which is the specific angular momentum per unit mass of Earth and the big guys, and we simply plotted them on a radiation output versus angular momentum. And you get this wondrous straight line plot with the sun up here way off the line because, of course, it's this plus fusion. What is this? This appears to be basically internal fluid friction.
Or gravitational collapse.
It's not gravitational collapse. That has been tested and found wanting.
Well, I don't know where you're getting your data from, Richard.
Well, John Anderson, for one, who
So-
was a celestial mechanics guy who did the modeling of the interiors, the J2 models from the flybys, which give us internal structure.
Okay, here's what you need to do. You claim you've got predictions. You need to show how your predictions are distinct from models.
Well, no, let me tell you what the prediction is. You know, you're right, I missed that part. It's getting late. Our prediction versus the mainstream guys is that if this is hyperdimensional transfer of energy from a higher state space, what we will see is a variability in the infrared output of these planets. The gravitational contraction model, because of the enormous timescales involved, basically they're constant light bulbs. They're going to emit tomorrow the same amount of energy as they did last week and last year and last decade and the last million years, all right? But our model says that they will vary, like turning up and down a potentiometer, and that ground-based infrared observations now and a year from now and a year from then, compared to the Voyager and Cassini baselines, will show remarkable variability. In fact, if you go to the literature and do a literature search, which we have done, you find from the 60s to now that variability is in the papers published in the literature, and again, no one can explain it because they don't have a model that says anything should be varying from the helium drip model to the massive radioactive core model to the gravitational contraction model. All of these models are basically steady state. The HD model says they should vary, and we know why they should vary, and that goes back to that lab data that I want that you might help me get.
In order to stimulate that, what you're going to have to do is show that your model is making predictions distinct from all the other models.
Well, they don't predict the variability, and we do. That's
Okay.
distinct.
No,
That's
and you
pretty-
also
that's
have to
pretty-
persuade the scientific community that these are distinctive predictions. If you're the only one that's saying that they're distinctive predictions, no one's going to fund this. But if you can get the scientific community to agree with you,
Wait, you mean to tell me that somebody at the edge can never get funding because their idea is too far out and nobody agrees with them? How can they agree
no,
with
no,
this?
all you
until they
need
do
to,
an
no, hold
experiment?
it. You're misunderstanding me.
That's a tautology.
No, you're misunderstanding me. Okay, what I'm saying is you need to get a consensus in the scientific community that this is a distinctive predictive test. If you got that under your belt, then you got a good chance of getting it funded. But if you're the only one that's saying that this is a distinctive test, don't be surprised if it never gets funded.
And I guess, Dr. Ross, what I'm hearing tonight is Richard trying to make you his prime candidate for selling you on this tonight.
Well, one of
So-
them.
Well, he needs to
There we
sell
go.
somebody.
There we go. Richard, another question that has come up that seems very interesting to folks is the political angle to all of the research. You have provided the McDaniel report, which appears to say, with a peer review substantiation, that there is a suppression of Cydonia data going on. What about the presidential administrations over the last number of years? For example, President Carter described his own UFO sighting. President Reagan mentioned on at least 5 occasions, including at the United Nations, that wouldn't it be an amazingly unifying factor for the human race if extraterrestrials were to come to the fore. Just curious, what is your sense of what's happening in the political spectrum, even up into today, the political spectrum, in order for this material to either be suppressed or encouraged to be released?
Well, again, based on firsthand experience, political experience, I have no qualms in saying the fix is in. The agency, major elements of the government, which is the agency, do not want this ever verified. That's the bad news. Now, the good news is I saved money from Geico on my car insurance. No.
And our time is almost...
The good news is that, well, come on, it's very late. The good news is that this does not seem to be a monolithic opposition. We've got friends in NASA, I think that we have, for instance, in the Odyssey data, that stunning pre-dawn image, which I presume you saw this morning, that was taken at exactly the right time to be a definitive test. If I can get, with a little help from my friends and the Art Bell audience and a lot of you here, Dr. Newcomb to do a 2-meter color image as opposed to 20 meters at a successive, he has the capability of taking a successive set of stereo images over several minutes. If we're right, if there's specular reflection from the eastern side, a prediction is that, like with any specular reflection, it's like a mirror. You fly through the beam of the reflection and it will turn on and go off. If it's Lambert scattering, if it's just a bright snowy surface, it will just not turn on and off. It'll be constant over the period of observation. If we can get Newcomb to actually do that kind of a test, which requires not that he just take pictures, but he take pictures on a specific time frame, I believe the model will be confirmed. And that's a hard stand and fall model. If it's artificial, if it's panels that are oriented at a specific geometry, if it's siding, all right, in other words, it should basically have one characteristic that camera can tell us about. I'm frankly much more interested in this test, because if this is telling us something, it changes everything. It goes together with De Palma, it goes together with the grass experiment, it goes together with the whole Cambrian thing, it goes together with other dimensionality which is usable technologically, it goes together with the concept of, quote, free energy, which can transform this hate-filled, competitive problem we have on this planet into one where we have more longevity because we have the means to give people the physical things that they require without destroying the planet. So to me, this is the more important thing to test, and this is so much cheaper because you can do this with a small telescope and an infrared detector and an honest guy.
And Richard, I'm also hearing that you're saying by the persons who have attended here tonight, getting active to contact scientists, to contact politicians, that there has been a positive influence exerted.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I have a request, and I think I echo everybody up here, and if I don't, you'll let me know. I'd like you to drop a line or send an email to Art. Art went out on a limb and put Mike and me on, and basically canned the third part of the show with open lines so that he could push this conference and let people know of the importance of this kind of discussion. And if you give him the evidence that he wanted to hear, which is it worked, you had fun, you learned things, we didn't kill each other up here, that will help us take it to the next level and continue the conversation in other places around this country. And I frankly am betting that politically we can change the hearts and minds of the political power structure, which is still the American people, if we expose them to reasons why they should care about these questions. And for one, I've had an extraordinary experience today here. I've enjoyed meeting and discussing and confronting and debating with everyone, and I would love to do it again in a larger context and with other people that will be added to an important conversation.
David, the final question for yourself is a fascinating one. He asks, how do you explain the relationship between Mars and Earth in terms of finding on Mars lion-type symbolism, zodiac-type symbolism, when it seems that the lion, the symbols of the zodiac, are all earth-bound creatures and symbols that seem to relate to the Earth? So what does the sense come from of finding that symbolized on Mars?
That fits into that messianic sort of interpretation of it. I find that if you talk to most Jewish sages, they're still looking for a Messiah based on the Old Testament data that they're looking for. The criteria has to be met. The Messiah has to be from the tribe of Judah. He has to be, virgin birth. All these things come together. They miss the first advent, but they're still looking for somebody to rule. And when you look on Sidonia, you see that idea in the face. There's some other aspects to it that actually I didn't touch, but were in the Monuments of Mars book from Richard, and that is the idea that it's actually aligned to a solstice at a certain point, several million years ago, and I can't remember exactly.
It's half a million round numbers, but that doesn't address the double-sided, the hominid lion side.
No, but just the idea that if it was sighted from the city during the solstice, you would actually see the sun rise in the mouth of this thing, which is Genesis,
Yeah, you'd also see the Earth when it aligned at particular parts of the cycle.
And that's, gospel too. You have the first part of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, spoke the worlds into creation. Basically, that's an idea that...
But see, that speaks to frequency again, because what is verbal communication but vibrations in the air?
And in the occult,
how does God
Kabbalism,
create a new world?
and
Maybe
in mythos,
with hyperdimensional physics.
this whole idea of speaking creation into being with words, that's sacred art the Egyptians had with the hieroglyphics, the idea that if God spoke the worlds into creation, and they believe this, then if they too learned how to record words, they would actually have some power, of God and creation. Anyway, it all goes back to the messianic points again. So that lion idea, if God's the one who created it all and the Messiah is being typified by the lion, then obviously if Christ, the one that's being typified, was the creator of all things, then he would have some foreknowledge of what the creation he was going to use to typify himself would be. Okay. And that's why I think it's, an extent.
So it's a symbology speaking across time to a receptive audience that has those symbols in their consciousness now.
Right.
The next question is to Mike Heiser. Who are the Nephilim? What is the possibility that there's a connection between Nephilim and extraterrestrial intelligence?
Well, I don't see, again, the whole, part of this has to do again with, are there actual extraterrestrials that are distinct from spiritual entities that can take physical form? The short answer is that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Of course, that requires a literal interpretation, which was I'm going to say dominant, which I know is true. I'd like to say exclusive. Since I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the early church or the rabbinic period, I will say overwhelmingly dominant view up until the 3rd century A.D. when Julius Africanus and after him Augustine came up with the Sethite hypothesis. I mean, everybody up until that point took this as a literal event, and that's where I'm at as well. Not for just that reason, but for a whole lot of other reasons. Whether this relates, again, to this visitation from the sons of God and the daughters of men, that could be the explanation for what people think of as an extraterrestrial situation or visitation. Today I said in my own presentation, I don't think it has to be. I think the questions are separable. We just won't know. One thing I think we can say is definite, because the text is quite clear, is that it was a negative thing. I mean, the whole motivation for not only the creation of man, but any kind of interaction with humankind was to essentially enslave humanity. I mean, that's not a good thing if you're a human. So, I mean, it's it's cross-cultural in ancient terms. It's not always negative, but it's predominantly negative.
It leads me to add that you have a great deal more about the identity of the Nephilim on your website, as I think is true in terms of pretty much all the questions that were turned in tonight, that each one of the speakers answers these questions in depth on their websites, and encourage folks to go to that. Our last question tonight is for Dr. Nelson. It was a question, Dr. Nelson, about a filter example that you gave in your presentation. And the person asked the question, does it appear to you that the news media in particular is serving as a knowledge filter, maybe the Academy of Sciences you described as serving as a knowledge filter, with the result that our culture is being conditioned away from critical thinking, and therefore folks are unwilling to listen to the kind of scientific research and historical and theological research that has been presented today?
I'd have to say no, because there's a great difference between the mass of the American population and that very small percentage of people in the National Academy or the elite science bodies in the United States. I'll take a topic that we haven't discussed much today, Darwinian evolution. Poll data over the decades, and these numbers are pretty consistent from one Gallup poll to the next, show that about 90% of the American public rejects Darwinian evolution. That's 9 out of 10. Of that 90%, 45%, roughly half, are what is often called young earth creationists of one stripe or another. The other half think that evolution occurred, but that it was superintended by God, that the only reason that we're here is because God watched over the evolutionary processes and guided it along the way. Only 10%, roughly, of the American population accepts fully naturalistic Darwinian evolution, but in that 10% are most scientists. So you've got a populace that by and large does not accept what they hear from PBS, Sagan, National Geographic, you name it. So I would say that the American people in general are much more open to considering alternatives to, Richard called, sort of ideas on the fringe, if you will.
Cutting edge.
Marvelous.
Fringe is a nice place to be. I don't know.
Surreys have fringes.
Yeah, you can be safe in the center of the herd, but it's pretty boring in the center of the herd. So I guess I would answer that question no. There's a lot of hand-wringing in the National Academy about why this is the case. Frankly, I think it's the case because if you give one theory an educational monopoly, particularly if you tell bright high school students, we're not going to talk about those ideas, they're forbidden. What's the practical consequence? Well, that high school kid is now going to want to know all about those forbidden ideas.
That's true.
So the worst thing that ever happened to Darwinism, to stay with that topic, was to become the official position.
Yeah, but if he can't publish, when he goes through the system and he can't publish in a journal because it is verboten. I mean, Carlotto has had awful success with all his credibility, credentials, degrees, etc., punching all the right buttons. He can't get published on Sidonia, in Icarus, in JGR, in any of the accepted planetary science journals. He has to publish in the information journals.
Listen, I agree with you about that. But the question was, is there a filter for the American population as a whole about ideas like this? And I would say no. In fact, if anything, the science establishment is desperately unhappy about their inability to control what people hear and take an interest in.
Isn't it just one segment of the scientific community? I mean, there was a survey done in 1916 on the beliefs of scientists about God and evolution, showing that about 45% believe in God and believe in an afterlife.
Lack of belief in God is much higher among biologists, in particular among historical biologists, than it is among physicists. So in the science community, you will find great differences in religious belief.
Well, that is certainly true. It's belief in God is highest amongst mathematicians and physicists, and lowest when you get down to, biology is not the worst. The humanities are even below that. However, the point I was making is a survey done in 1914 produces the identical numbers as a survey done in 1998.
Right.
Now, the belief was that, as science advances, we're going to see this belief in God and a creator diminish. But even amongst the scientists, it hasn't diminished in 80 years.
Right. That's a good qualification. I'm glad you made it.
Now, Richard?
I don't know what it means. I just have a feeling, and I've had it for a couple of years, and I've got some really interesting people to share it with. And if anybody knows what this means, please tell me. This is how you generate a hypercube. A hypercube is the extension of the 27-line model. It's called a tesseract. It's that object at the bottom of the screen. You start with a one-dimensional thing, and you fold it up, and you wind up with a cube in 3 dimensions. This is a tesseract in 4 dimensions. This is what a cube looks like in mathematical space of 4 dimensions, and then this is supposed to represent what will happen in 5, 6, and 7, etc. Okay? This is the part that fascinates me, because Dahlia was known for unusual thinking. All right? Christ crucified on a tesseract. What was he trying to say?